Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for a video game economics lecture. Today's topic is inflation in Animal Crossing. I want to start out with a fundamental question. Does it feel like goods are significantly more expensive in Animal Crossing New Horizons versus previous entries in the series? I know as I've been playing, I've had that feeling myself. And so, as we dig into it, I want to see, can we model this quantitatively? And are there any complicating factors that might mitigate this picture? In order to answer this question, we're going to use an economics tool called the Consumer Price Index. Now, don't worry if these formulas look a little confusing right now. We'll go into them more in detail later. The big thing to remember is that these two formulas are the main thing that we'll be using to assess inflation. And so, you'll note in the first formula, there's this idea of a market basket that helps inform what the Consumer Price Index is. And so, in economics, the market basket refers to a bundle of consumer goods used to measure inflation. The fluctuation in the prices of these goods signify the inflation relative to a given base year. Typically, these goods are staple products that are commonly sold, making them easy to measure across time. And so, we'll select a number of goods that have appeared in roughly the same form in both the original Animal Crossing and in Animal Crossing New Horizons to create an Animal Crossing market basket that we'll use to then measure inflation. And so, I've taken the liberty of going ahead and finding the item prices in both the original Animal Crossing and in Animal Crossing New Horizons for as many items as possible. The 28 or 29 you see here are the ones that have the exact same name, roughly the same, design, and have pricing information in both titles. You'll note that in New Horizons, with the advent of the crafting system, some items that were previously sold items became crafting-only items, and therefore not for sale. And so we have a limited list from which to work, but a list nonetheless that can give us the information we need. The Consumer Price Index as a tool is typically based on a sample of goods, not all goods anyway. And so let's go ahead and with these items calculate a Consumer Price Index for both games. So that's our market basket, right? And so the cost of all of those goods together in the original Animal Crossing is 88,440 bells. And so if you'll look at the first use of the formula, you'll note that it's cost of the Animal Crossing market basket in the original divided by itself, which will always equal 1. And so the Consumer Price Index for the original Animal Crossing will always be 100, because we're treating it as the base year in the original formula. And now let's look at New Horizons. The price of the goods in the market basket for New Horizons is 320,000 bells. And so we divide that by the 88,440 bells that same basket of good cost the original, multiply that by 100, and we get the Consumer Price Index for New Horizons at 361.83. And we'll use these numbers to now calculate inflation. So let's now calculate the rate of inflation. When we're calculating the rate of inflation, what we have to do is we have to use the Consumer Price Index of the point that is later in time, subtract and divide by the one that's earlier, and multiply by 100 to get a percent value. If that doesn't make exact sense, let's go through the actual example so you can see how it works in practice. So, to calculate the percent rate of inflation for New Horizons relative to the original Animal Crossing, we do the CPI of New Horizons minus the CPI of the original Animal Crossing, divide by the CPI of the original Animal Crossing, and multiply times 100. And so this is essentially getting us to what is a relative rate of inflation. And so that way we can see more clearly what the rate of inflation is relative to that point, rather than just picking some vacuous something out of thin air. And that's why it's good to have a base year, right? So a base year offers you something that's pretty clear in terms of where you're starting from, that 100 point. And you'll notice in the way that it interacts with the formula, there's actually a very nice simplification that we're able to do when using the base year. So we plug in all the numbers that we generated on the last slide. And so it's 361.83 minus 100 divided by 100 times 100. Now when you divide and multiply an item by 100, that's essentially like multiplying it by 1. It just cancels out. And so what we're able to do is we're able to just look at it as 361.83 minus 100 to get that relative percentage increase. Now, if you were doing this with a value that's not 100, say you were comparing the CPI of New Horizons to the Consumer Price Index of City Folk, then you would have to subtract the New Horizons value by whatever that City Folk value is and divide it so that you can get the relative percentage increase. Because it won't be perfectly, if the CPI for City Folk is 102, it won't be a 259% increase. It'll be slightly less than that just by the nature of percentages. And so this formula just keeps you honest in generating that actual raw percentage difference between the two items that may or may not be as mathematically nice as using the base here, or the base example in using Animal Crossing Classic like we are in this one. And so ultimately with that simplification, you're able to then just take it to being 361.83 minus 100, which equals 261.83%. And so that is the rate of inflation between Animal Crossing New Horizons and the original Animal Crossing. Or, put another way, it's the rate of inflation from the original Animal Crossing to Animal Crossing New Horizons, 261.83%. And so let's dig into the data a little to see how that actually comes about. If you look at this table, you'll notice that some goods have what I will call an obscene rate of inflation, most notably the harp, at 7,547% relative to its original price in Animal Crossing Classic. And so, looking at the raw data, you can also see the average price has increased by nearly 8,000 bells across the board. Looking at the high inflation items, you can see that the shift was driven primarily by entertainment and electronic appliances, while more basic functional items had lower rates of inflation, with some actually falling in price, and articulating a localized deflation. That's not actually that unusual. Uncorrelated product markets may experience price fluctuations independent of each other or of the market as a whole. And so what you see when you look at this table, though, altogether, is that many of the items, probably anything from about rock guitar on up, have experienced higher than what would be normal inflation over the course of about 20 years, pegging normal inflation to about 2% per annum. And so, while this paints a pretty compelling picture that the inflation is quite high, and that New Horizons does have a massively inflated price, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the whole story. And so let's talk about some complicating factors. The Consumer Price Index relies on a sample and is therefore an imperfect measure of actual inflation. For example, in New Horizons, many new high and low price items that were not in the original game were included. And therefore there's no basis of comparison for said items, but they do impact the economic burden on a given consumer or a given player. And sales prices may not have changed in the same way. While furniture sales prices follow the same formula as in previous Animal Crossing games, the sales prices for fish, bugs, fruit, and other goods that are sources of funds for most players have not commensurately risen with inflation, many being the exact same. This means the player must work harder for the same reward, because the sales price of most fish is still capped at 15,000 bells, same as in the original game. And so you need to sell more of those fish to buy any given item on average than you did before. And so the inflation has not reached the seller's market in the same way. And so, as a little critical thinking question for you, just to leave you with this, does this suggest that the Nookling Shop may be exerting some monopoly power in their pricing as the only buyer and seller on the island? I'll leave you with that to consider. But so, I want to say thank you so very much. I hope this has been informative, and I hope you'll join me back for another video game economics lesson.